Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of university and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. Today I'm back with a psychological case. I haven't really done one of these in a little while and they're possibly one of my most requested videos to do on this channel because I think it's kind of like what I like to consider my unique identifier on my channel, since I am a psychology student and I love everything psychology related. Having this sort of little bit of psychology in my channel is just like one of my favourite things that I can introduce in videos. So it's been a little while and today we're going to be discussing something called the Carney-Landis experiment, also sometimes known as the facial expressions experiment. From what I can tell from my research, this is quite a well-known and controversial experiment, but I personally never come across it in my studies. Obviously it depends on where you studied, what topics you studied in psychology, everything like that. A lot of the ones I've discussed in the past I've personally come across in my A-level psychology studies, but this is not one of them. So it was kind of like I was learning something new at the same time as researching this for you guys. As always, I'm just going to have a little disclaimer at the start of this video. Just like all of my true crime videos as well, I like to put this disclaimer in just in case anyone isn't aware of like what I do and the videos I make and other people who make these sorts of videos. Just so you guys know, I'm not claiming to be an expert in any of these cases. I am simply portraying any information that I have pieced together myself on the internet. So basically everything that I found in this video is just what I've come across from my own research online, and I'm not trying to offend anyone or do anyone an injustice. With that being said, if you want to hear a little bit about the Carney-Landis experiment, then keep on watching and we shall just get started. The Carney-Landis experiment, like I said, are commonly referred to as the facial expressions experiment, was an experiment set out to kind of investigate this age-old question within psychology surrounding emotion and just what kind of creates emotion in a sense. So whether the physiological changes that we experience during an emotion trigger the mental association with it being a certain emotion, or whether it's the other way around, whether your brain automatically thinks, oh, I'm going to feel this, and then that triggers the physiological responses. It's really a question of cause and effect, and it's one that is still studied today. I know I've just had a module where we kind of discuss this whole which came first. So for example, when you're experiencing something like an extreme excitement, do you recognise the emotion first, which then triggers the physiological changes like your heart rate increasing and you feeling flushed, and ultimately this endorphin rush is sent through your body? Or does the recognition of the endorphin rush occur first, which then triggers the mental association with the feeling of excitement? Hopefully I've explained that well. I know it's a little bit wordy. Without delving too far into the psychology of emotion, I'll just give a very, very brief summary so you kind of have an understanding of the basis behind the theory that inspired this experiment. So the James-Lange theory of emotion is one of the earliest, and it was probably one of the most prominent of its time, theories of emotion, which favoured the idea that the brain's detection of physiological responses, so your brain going, oh, I'm experiencing this endorphin rush, then triggers the association of the emotion. So you feel the physiological changes like your heartbeat changing, and then your mind goes, I'm feeling excitement, and that's when you start to feel excited, if that makes sense. This theory, along with others all of the same calibre at the time, all struggled with the issue of not being able to actually gain any physical or empirical evidence to back up their basis. As a lot of the issues are with psychology, when you're looking at theories, a lot of them are, they struggle to find any empirical evidence because of the nature of psychology, because of the nature of what we are studying. And so enter the 1924 Carney-Landis experiment. So Carney-Landis wanted to investigate this theory, look into some evidence to support this theory, acting upon the basis that if all emotions are universal, then surely there would be a specific area of the brain that is in charge or is completely in control of triggering every single specific emotion. And if this was the case, like I said, if emotions were universal, then this area of the brain that triggers certain emotions would be the same in every person that he studied. Carney-Landis himself was a graduate from Minnesota University, and he pretty much dedicated his life's research to studying facial movements or facial muscle movements in response to emotional stimuli when they were presented to a person, and this was the basis of his facial expressions experiment. He'd hoped to find matching patterns across all participants when specific emotional stimuli were displayed to them, so their facial muscle movements would be the same when they are showed specific emotions. And this had been his aim, to prove that there were specific areas of the brain in every person that would trigger every single emotion. His participants were a varying group of people, although the majority were other students that he either knew from his academics, so while he was studying at university, or he had known of them and their academic past. So there was a mix, but the majority were fellow students or graduates. When he gained each one of his participants, he would bring them in and he painted marks on each of their faces, marking each of the specific facial muscles. This way he could take note of each particular muscle, when it was triggered, when it was moving, while the experiment was going on, so he can look back and mark each movement to try and match them up. And essentially the long and short of it was they were asked to individually sit down and be exposed to particular stimuli displaying a specific emotion, and he would then note down their muscle movements and which expressions were pulled, in hopes of kind of identifying this pattern. The early stages of the experiment weren't particularly controversial or traumatic for the participants, as they were kind of milder stimuli, so milder emotions were being showed. So they were showing things like, so they would be asked to do things basically like smelling something really abrasive. So I know there was one in particular where he was asking them to smell ammonia, which is obviously quite a strong smell, ideally I think to trigger the feeling of like disgust and to see what facial movements occur as a result of feeling this disgust or shock perhaps. In other phases they were asked to listen to jazz music and see their emotions relating to that, so kind of mild things like that. At one point he also asked them to tell a lie in order for him to note down their facial muscle movements when they were telling this lie. However, as these trials were completed, as he carried it on through each of the participants, he kind of began to notice that results weren't going to be anything significant whatsoever, and they weren't going to be very groundbreaking in support or even disproving the theory that he set out to investigate. So this is when he decided to kick things up a notch and things became quite controversial. Landis introduced another phase to participants, in which they were sat down like all of the other phases and basically exposed to pornographic pictures. Now this may not seem necessarily extremely distressing, especially when you hear some of the more extreme things that he would do later on in the experiment, but you have to bear in mind that these participants had no prior knowledge that they were going to be witnessing these pornographic images, and so not only is it a shock, but it is also quite violating. I know that if I was shown these sort of in a sense explicit and seemingly to some people perhaps aggressive images, inappropriate images might make people feel uncomfortable, and perhaps they're just seeing something that they don't want to see. So it is a violation to their personal preferences and even just to them as people to be shown these distressing explicit images without their prior consent. And then things got even more traumatic for participants from here, with them being subjected to viewing these images taken from medical cases in which individuals have basically had their really gruesome skin conditions photographed for their medical files. I'm not going to go too much into detail because it makes me quite squeamish, and I'm not a very squeamish person whatsoever. So again, obviously quite a violating thing to view these images without your prior consent. Another distressing phase involved him firing a gun unexpectedly in the same room as the participant to record their facial muscle movement, to see like this complete shock and complete fear, like immediate fear, this automatic response to see what muscles this triggered. And again, that is extremely distressing. But these distressing conditions still failed to provide the groundbreaking results that Landis had set out in hopes of finding. And so he continued to make things even more traumatic for participants, and he took things to a whole nother level. So participants were next asked to put their hand inside of a bucket and told to not look. So they had to do so without looking at the bucket, without looking at what was inside the bucket, and they had no idea what was going to be inside. And then, to their complete shock, like I said, they were completely blinded in a sense. They would put their hand inside this bucket and it would be a whole load of live frogs. And then their response to this shocking sensation, like this shocking feeling, was recorded. Once he recorded their movements though, he told them to keep their hands inside the bucket. They weren't to remove their hand. Instead, they had to rummage around through the live frogs and find something that he'd put in there. Now what this something was, that they didn't know what they were looking for. They were just instructed they had to look for something that felt out of place, that didn't feel like a live frog in a sense. And what it turned out to be was a bunch of live wires. And what would then happen, they would search through with their hands again, not being able to look, grab this bunch of electrical wires and receive a nasty shock. The shock was only mild, but it still was painful, especially considering it was completely unexpected. They had no idea what they were grabbing. And this reaction was once again recorded. Another distressing phase included Landis instructing the participants to hold out both of their hands palms up, and then in one hand they would be given a knife, and then in the other hand they would be given a live mouse. He told them they were simply required to use the knife that they were given to remove the mouse's head. And at this point the majority would become extremely openly skeptical. They would ask them why they had to do this. They would say, you know, was this actually something they needed to do, or was he testing them? Why they would need to do this? So they began openly questioning his authority in a sense. And some did go as far as to just refuse to do this act because they just didn't agree with it whatsoever, and they didn't think that any participant should have taken this turn. However, if this was the case, if one of these participants would refuse and there was no changing their mind, he would make them watch as he himself removed the mouse's head in front of them. So either way, they were going to be experiencing something extremely distressing. And as you can imagine, Landis began to get more towards the results that he had been hoping for. Some more extreme results and also more universal facial movement responses and emotional displays as they were becoming more and more like drastic phases, if that makes sense. And essentially, as the trials got more and more distressing and upsetting for the participants, their emotional responses became more obvious and clearer. However, the downside of this, which is definitely something that he probably should have considered from the start, it was like a question that popped up in my mind when I heard about how he was sort of going to carry out this experiment. The difficulty he faced was that yes, the emotions were becoming more obvious, so their expressions were becoming more drastic. However, they became incredibly difficult to interpret as not every emotion provides the same response. So for example, if someone's feeling extreme fear, some people might laugh, some people might cry, you know, out of nervousness, and some people might scream. So there isn't an exact universal response to every emotion. This was the case when he carried out this particular trial with the live mouse and the knife. He found that each of the emotions displayed by each of the participants, they might have been the same emotions, so they might have felt extreme fear or whatever he classed it as, but they showed completely different facial emotions and different reactions to it. So for example, some of the participants might respond to this extreme feeling of fear by screaming or shouting or crying, while some might freeze up completely and not show any emotion, while others would begin laughing hysterically, like out of control laughing, because this is different fear responses and everyone's fear is different for every person, so it wasn't as straightforward as he had hoped. In total, only a third of the participants refused completely to carry out the mouse beheading, and as a result they were subjected to watching Landis carry it out, and the remaining 2/3 reluctantly, I mean very reluctantly, beheaded the mouse. Now what is worth noting, like I said at the start, there was an extreme range of participants. A lot of them were students. However, there was one participant in particular that is often referred to in the discussion of this experiment, who was actually a 13-year-old boy who had been in the psychology department because he had been under watch in the psychology department of the school, and so Landis had access to him as a participant. So not only do you have to imagine a 13-year-old boy being subjected through some of these quite extreme and distressing trials, but also the boy himself was already under watch of the psychology department because he had been facing quite a few issues. In recent months he had displayed quite a few quite extreme psychological issues, as well as having a really high blood pressure, and so he was under careful watch because they were kind of hoping to diagnose him with something in hopes of treating him with whatever psychological issue he was having. And so not only was this 13-year-old boy being put through these awful experiences, but he was already psychologically vulnerable, which is just awful. And so his psychological issues paired with his extremely high blood pressure being put through this ordeal, you can imagine that this was ridiculously upsetting for him, and I dread to think how it affected him later in life. And to make matters even worse, once Landis ended his experiment and began to analyse his results, he found nothing absolutely groundbreaking or significant whatsoever. So I've written down here that he therefore reported finding there is no facial expression seen as being typical for responses to specific emotions, that emotions cannot be characterised by specific expression, smiling was displayed in virtually all phases in varying conditions, and a few other vague interpretations. The long and short of it is the experiment would never have been considered ethical by any means in today's psychological standards, so it wouldn't have been allowed to be taken part at all. It wouldn't have happened. As I'm sure you can imagine, as I'm sure you were thinking this entire way through, it's extremely unethical and just awful for the participants. But aside from this, the results and the conclusions gained from it weren't significant at all, so there was nothing that would begin to justify the trauma experienced by each of the participants. It wasn't worth it whatsoever. Carney Landis went on to have a very successful career with a special specialty in sexual psychopathology, and despite his many years of actually ethical and very influential research that was carried out perfectly and very well, this is what he is continued to be remembered for because of how distressing and awful it is. An interesting discussion point that I'm sure some of you will have picked up on, and I'm sure a couple of you will discuss or will have begun to discuss already in the comments, is that 2/3 of the participants went on to carry out the mouse beheading despite it being something that they clearly did not want to do, and they weren't really put under any stress. It's this whole discussion as found in a couple of other obedience studies and also just like authority studies. There's quite a lot. It's just an interesting discussion point considering that they probably weren't forced to, so I'm pretty sure Landis didn't stand in that room and shout at them until they beheaded the mouse, but they did so because they were believed that they had to, that he was the authority figure and that they had to behead this mouse, that he was their authority figure and they had to do as they were told, whereas 1/3 refused. So that is an interesting discussion point, and that leads on to the Milgram's obedience study that actually came about a few years afterwards. So in 1961, Milgram carried out his very famous experiment investigating this claim of whether obedience and authority can lead to people doing things that they really don't want to do. And so if you want a specific video on Milgram's obedience study, then let me know, because that is definitely one of the main ones that I haven't covered yet. I'm sure a lot of you are very aware of it, but there might be some of you that aren't. So if that is something you would like me to discuss, then let me know down below. So yeah, that is everything I'm going to discuss today. I hope you found this interesting. Feel free to let me know your thoughts down below, as well as any of your true crime related and non-true crime related requests. Always looking for video requests and inspiration, so feel free to let me know down below. Don't forget to follow me on all of my social media. I'll have them all on the screen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching.